So this is Costing Nature. This is the login screen for the commercial version, and we're going to log in as a mega user today. Mega user gives you more outputs than the free scientist interface. I'm going to log in using a test account. So bear with me while I log in. So this is where you could change your different user levels, but for now I'm going to leave that to mega user and then log in. Right. So this is the screen that you'll see when Costing Nature or Waterworld opens. They have a very similar interface, so always check on the left here which tool you are in, whether it's Costing Nature or Waterworld, because people tend to get confused quite easily between the two because the interface is so similar. So the way to get started with doing a run is to move to your area of interest. So you can either zoom out and just drag the map to where you need to be, or you can type in a location here, hit go. And the system will always run the tile that is highlighted. So if I move the map down, you see that the highlighted tile shifts. And so I'm going to move it up because I want to run this particular tile at the top here. Okay, so the tile that will be run in this case will be either the large blue 10 degree tile or the smaller 1 degree tile, and that is set by the choice that I make here. So I'm going to give this run a name, call it Columbia 1 kilometer. And I'm going to leave this to 1 kilometer. So if I leave this to 1 kilometer, we will run the big blue tile at 1 kilometer resolution. If I would switch this to 1 hectare, then it will run this smaller tile, the 1 degree tile, at 1 hectare resolution. So once I've set that up, I can click on Define Area. Go. And now at the top here we can see run Columbia 1 kilometer, and we are in the alternative baseline. We can also see that we are in Costing Nature version 2 at the top, and we're using the commercial use interface. So this is step 1. We've defined our run. The next step then is to prepare our data. So I'm going on the left here, in the left pane. I'm using step 2. I'm going to click on step 2, prepare data. That opens up a new screen. And that allows me to have a look at some of the data that we have in the Simterra database. So if I click on the plus minus here, I can see all 118 maps are found for this tile. So I'm good to go. The only thing I need to do now is I need to copy over this data from the Simterra server to my own workspace, and we can do that by clicking copy data directly to your workspace. So if I click on that, what the system will do is it will start copying over all the data from Simterra and bringing it into your own workspace. Now, depending on your user level, you will have 3 or 6 runs available for you to store in your under your username. But it's good practice to delete any old runs once you've done with them. And also, you won't be allowed to carry out any further runs until you've cleaned up your the runs that are in your user space. So this should only take a few minutes max. If you move your mouse over these little green blocks, then it tells you what it's doing. So that's it. Now it tells me that data is ready. So we can now have a look at some of the data that is in our workspace. So if I click on the plus minus here, it should open a list. There we go. There you go. So this is all the data that is in there. Now some data you can have a look at, and that data will be indicated by this green icon, and some of them you can't, and then there will be a lock against them. So for some of the data that you can't have a look at, you can get some of the statistics. So if you click on the sum icon next to it, you can get some of the statistics of those maps. And there's also a view by function which allows you to view the map aggregated over other maps. So let me just click on this. So this is the model mean precipitation change to 2050s. If I click on show map stats and then I hover my mouse over result, then it gives me the statistics of that particular map. So our mean precipitation change to 2050s for this particular tile is 350 millimeters a year. So that's a way to look at some of the data, even if that data is licensed and therefore you can't have a look at it. Some of the data here you can download, but most of it you won't be able to look at because it's under license. So once we set up our data, we're actually ready to go. So I'm just going to close this window for now, and then we're going to move to step 3, which is to start simulation. So I'm going to click on step 3. And now I have two options. As I said earlier, costing nature scales between 0 and 1, and that can either be based on a global normalization, or it could be done locally. So if I click on index locally, my maps will scale between 0 and 1 for the local tile, for the tile that I'm running. The default actually is indexing globally. So if I leave it like this, then somewhere in the world there will be a value of 1, but it's not necessarily within your tile. And that's obviously a way to look at or to compare different areas. So if you run 2 tiles in different areas of the world, you want to leave it to index globally, because then you can actually compare the results. For now I'm going to leave it to global. So I'm going to click on start, and that's all we need to do here. So we need to make that decision, and then we need to click on start, and that will set the simulation running, and it will tell you what it's doing. So currently it's calculating threats to biodiversity and ecosystem services. And for costing nature, that shouldn't take too long, perhaps a few minutes. But whilst it's doing that, we can look at some of the other options here in the help on the left here, because this is where we have our system documentation. So if I click on that, a window opens and that will load up a user guide for costing nature, and so there is a disclaimer, fair use policy, a quick start guide. So basically this tells you how to get started, how to set up a run. So if you have any questions, then I advise you to have a look at the user guide first if you get stuck, because it's very likely that the answer will be in there. So we have the user guides in the system documentation, but we also have the model documentation here, and that opens up in a new tab, I think. And that gives you the documentation, Costing Nature version 2, and it will describe all the modules in more detail and what they mean and how they are calculated. Right. So if you have any questions on how Costing Nature is doing its calculations, then I advise you to have a look at the documentation there. So let's have a look at our simulation control window. So you can now see that it has completed. So because it's completed, we can shut this window. We could have closed this window earlier, as it says here, you may close this window, break the connection, or switch off the computer. Because once you set the simulation going, it starts running on our servers, and so you can just log out and log back in later, and the run will have finished. So you don't need to leave this window open or even leave your computer on whilst it's running. Right, so I'm going to close that, and we can now have a look at some of the results. So we've done step 1, define the run. We've done step 2, which is to prepare the data. We've done step 3, which is to actually run the simulation. And we're going to skip step 4 because that's looking at policy exercises, or that's alternatives. So that's the scenarios that we can run now. But if you want to look at the output, we need to click on step 5, results maps. And that opens up a new window again. And there you will see all your output maps. So if we scroll down to the bottom, you can see we have our services in here. So we have, for instance, our relative total potential bundle services. So this is a map that bundles the water, the carbon, the nature-based tourism, and hazard mitigation services, potential services. Then we have the same, but then in terms of realized services. But we also have the maps of these services separately. So we have the relative realized water provisioning services, the relative potential realized carbon services, and recreation services. And then we can also look at the ratio of locally to globally realized services. Right. So let's have a look at some of these maps. So for instance, let's have a look at the potential and realized carbon services index. So this is the relative carbon sequestration and relative carbon stock. And the way to look at a map in both Waterworld and Costing Nature is by clicking on the display and GeoBrowse map. And that opens up this viewer window and loads up the map. So this gives us the relative potential carbon value index, scaled between 0 and 1, but then globally. So our values in this particular area only go up to 0.5. And we can clearly see where we have high carbon sequestration and where we have much lower values. So we can look at this map in a number of different ways. Underneath the map we have the... Okay, I seem to have lost you. So we were looking at the potential carbon value index. And so there's a number of ways we can look at those maps. So underneath the map we have the option to change the image. That allows me to set a minimum and a maximum. I can change the color scale here. We can do a shifted log scale. We can also look at positives only, or negatives only, or non-zeros only. We can do a normalization of the map. We can threshold the map. So say we only want to look at certain values, so say the top 15% or something like that. You can do that here. And then finally, completely underneath here, we have the download, and that allows you to download the map. Then at the top we have the view by function. So if I click on that, the system will start working, and it will generate a list of maps that I can use to aggregate these maps over. So obviously these are pixel based values, but I can look at the mean of those values based on other maps. So for instance, if I look, for instance, sub-basins, this one doesn't seem to be running actually. I don't know what that means. But this normally allows you to aggregate maps based on other maps. We'll try that again later in Waterworld and see if it works there. It should work. So the other things we have here are underneath the map. So we can look at this map on Google Earth. We can look at it in Google Maps. So if I click on Google Maps, then the map will be opened and draped over Google Maps. I'll wait for a moment until it loads. We can switch it on and off here, and we can change the opacity, and obviously you can zoom around, and you see the little crosshair in the middle here, and we can use that to get individual values within the map. So for instance, we have reasonably high values here at the top, and I can get the specific value by clicking on query and wait for it to load, and then I can see that my carbon value at that particular point is 0.467, and so we can do that for any of the other points as well. So we can take a snapshot as well, and then at the top here we have a share link. So if I click on that, then the system will generate a permalink. So this is a URL that you can save or send to someone, and once they open that, then this is the map that they will see, and that's a great way of sharing results with other people or with yourself. Right, so I'm going to close that, and let's have a look at some of the other outputs. So that was the potential realized carbon services index. I'm not going to look at all the specific services, but let's have a look at the total realized bundled services. So this is all services, so that's water, carbon, nature-based tourism, and hazard mitigation. And this is the realized services. And so what I can do is I can pop out this map by clicking on pop out, and then for instance I can compare that with the potential bundled services index. So we have the relative total potential bundled services index here. Let me bring that up. So on the left we have realized services, on the right we have potential services. So what's clear from this map is that we obviously have very high potential services here in the Amazon, and that's obviously most likely through the carbon sequestration. But because there are no beneficiaries of those services in that area, the realized services are low. Now we can also, because this is a bundled map, if we want to know values of each particular service at a point, I'm going to look at it in Google Maps overview and wait until the map loads. Give it a moment. There we go. And so I can zoom or bring my crosshair to this particular area, click on query, and we have a value of 0.468 there. If I then click on inputs and click on the query inputs icon next to it, a page will open, and that will give me the value of those 4 services at that point. So if I click on show these separate values, I can also click on show all, we can see that at that particular point, the reason why we have a high services or high potential services is because our carbon value is high, our hazard mitigation services are high, but our nature-based tourism and water, actually water is high, is 1, but our nature-based tourism is very low at that point. So the reason why we have a high index is because we have relatively high values for carbon, hazard mitigation, and obviously we have very high value for water provisioning as well. So that's a way to separate out, once you look at the bundled maps, And you can do that for any of the output maps. You can query and look at the different components that make up the value at that point. Right, so I'm going to close that and close that, and then I need to probably find my results map again. So we have looked at some of the services. We looked at carbon, we looked at the bundled services. Then at the top here we can look at our combination map. So we have our priority index for development based on realized services, and we have our priority index for development based on potential services, and then we have priority for nature conservation based on realized services and on potential services. So if we want to look at an area where we have a low conservation priority, low ecosystem services and pressured, and therefore it's a development priority index, then we click on that. And let's see where we have areas where there is low ecosystem services, low nature conservation priority. So for instance, the blue areas in this map are areas where it's pressured, low ecosystem services and low nature conservation priorities. Now let's have a look at some of the final other maps. So that was the development index. Now let's have a look at the conservation priority index based on realized services. So this is pressured and threatened conservation priority areas where you have high realized services. So basically the opposite of the development priority index. And that gives us a completely different picture. Basically showing us those areas where we have very high ecosystem services, realized ecosystem services, and very high nature conservation priority. So basically areas where you don't want to develop. So in the context, what are high realized services are scoring high on those 4 services that are taken into account in costing nature. So high water provision, high carbon sequestration, high nature-based tourism, and the last one is our natural hazard mitigation. And so threatened species are taken into account in terms of our and I need to look at the different maps we have here. So we have the conservation priorities. So basically that's based on an overlay of the different maps provided by conservation organizations of where the conservation priorities are. And for species there is an endemism index in there. Future threats are based on accessibility, proximity to recent deforestation, projected change in population and GDP, projected climate change, current distribution of nighttime lights. And pressures are based on population, frequency of wildfires, grazing intensity, agriculture intensity, dam density, and infrastructure. Now at the top we have some new features, and those are the red plus indicators. And that tells us the carbon stock that is pressured and threatened. And so these maps are based on deforestation in the area. So if we look at, for instance, pressured carbon sequestration, so this is high carbon sequestration areas where you have high current agriculture, infrastructural and other anthropogenic pressures. So these are the areas where we have the carbon stock under pressure from agriculture, infrastructural and other anthropogenic pressures. And then we can also have a look at threatened carbon sequestration. So this is high carbon sequestration areas where you have high future agriculture, infrastructural and other anthropogenic threats. And so these metrics are very useful, for instance, in REDD+ planning. And so I think the best way to sort of get a feel for this is by running the model yourself and having a look at the different outputs. But essentially that is the kind of outputs that costing nature generates. So now we've run a baseline. So I'm going to close the output maps now. And now you would be able to look at some of the policy exercise. So you can now, once you've done your baseline simulation, you looked at the results, you can then go back to step 4, policy exercises, and then see what options you have there. So we have 3 options here. One of them is the change input maps, and that allows you to change any of the data input maps for your own. But there's 2 other options. So we have the land use and land cover change scenarios. So that allows you to implement your own afforestation, deforestation scenarios, or you can do priorities and values, and that allows you to change your priorities and values assigned to elements of conservation priority. Let's have a look at that just quickly. So we can do 2 things here. We can do prioritization or we can do valuation. So prioritization means that you can change priorities associated with different components of conservation priority. You can increase or decrease the weight for different components based on local priorities. So you can, for instance, change the value of carbon in areas that are subject to REDD projects. Whereas with valuation, you can change the actual values with which different ecosystem services are held. So you can increase or decrease values attached to specific services across the entire map, or you can target that in particular parts of the map. So you could, for example, increase the value placed on watershed services upstream of dams. So if I click on that, and show you what it means. So you can set a name for a policy, then you can change the weighting on a scale between 0.1 to 1 for each of the different services, and then you can target that based on other areas. So for instance, and I'm not sure this is going to work, but let's have it go. So this is the example that was given. You could, for instance, give a higher weighting to watersheds of dams for water-based services. And because all of these dam watersheds have a unique ID, I can set my values to, I'm going to close this so you can see it, so target where watersheds of dams equals a value of, and then I can set it to anything, but in this case if I would set it greater to 0, it would target whatever I implement here only in those areas. And this is the way that all the scenarios in Waterworld and Costing Nature work, where you can target based on different maps. You can target really specifically where you want your scenario to act. So you have the whole list of maps on here. So I'm not going to run the scenario now, but that's a way of changing your prioritization or your valuation. And then obviously we have the land use, land cover change options, or we have the change input maps option. So I'm going to close that now, and I'm going to show you one more thing, and that is your manage simulations on the left here. So on the simulation we have manage simulation, and if I click on that, it allows me to have a look at all the simulations that are held in the system done by me. So we have the choice here between the 10 degree tile or the 1 degree tile resolution simulations. The one we've just done was a 10-degree tile one, so I'm going to leave that. Submit choice, and now I can see I'm currently storing a total of 5 runs out of a maximum of 7, and this is combined between Waterworld and Costing Nature. But just in order for me to have enough space, I'm going to delete one of my runs here. So this, if I scroll down, you can see all the runs that I've done. So this one was done today for this area, and you can see run status completed. But I don't need this run anymore, so I'm going to delete it. Are you sure you want to delete? Yes. And now, if I refresh, it will tell me that I have 1 run less on the system. So now it's 4 out of 7. So the whole refresh button is quite important as well. The system, because it opens all those new windows, not always will it refresh automatically. In that case, make sure to hit refresh or click on hit F5 on your keyboard, and it will refresh the page. I'm going to close that. Another way of getting to your run is by clicking on the active link where it says run, and that will bring me directly into my current run. So basically this is the same page, and I go straight to the run that I've currently active, and you can see what the status is. So in this case, that run is completed. So I'm going to close that now, and I'm going to log out, and that concludes our Costing Nature demonstration for today.